This is lecture 2 in our class, Ideology and Politics, and if you could be reading chapters 2 and 3 in the Weatherly book on ideologies. Those chapters deal with conservatism and liberalism as ideologies. As I mentioned in lecture 1, the Western tradition, the dominant ideology that shapes us, is liberalism. We might ask ourselves then, what is liberalism? And of course, there's various ways of understanding that word. And what I'd like to do in this particular lecture is look at what we call classical liberalism, which is different from modern liberalism and different from what might be called postmodern liberalism. So what I'd like to do is break this lecture into two parts, look at the principles of liberalism, and then look at the content of liberalism within the classical phase of liberalism. And I'll explore that by touching on the principles and then some of the content of that as it emerged in the late 15th century, 16th, and 17th centuries. So what are some of the principles of liberalism? Well, most of us who have grown up in Western society are acutely aware of certain basic principles or premises of liberalism. We could call them prejudices. Prejudices, again, has come to mean a nasty word. It just means prejudgments, that's all. So we're all prejudiced. We all have prejudgments in terms of how we try and make sense of the world that we live in. Now, at the level of principles, liberalism, if I can look at, briefly touch maybe 6 or 7 elements of those principles and then see how they play themselves out in social, religious, economic, political, literary terms, and how they changed throughout history, which I'll be exploring in the 3rd and 4th lecture as well. So some of the principles of liberalism are liberty, obviously, or freedom. Equality or egalitarianism comes out of that. Individuality or individualism is very important in something like that. Agency or choice, the responsibility of the individual to choose. Some element of historicism, we are historic beings. Martin Heidegger talks about we are all live in a state of thrownness. We're thrown into a moment of history, into a body, into a period of time, into a language, into a color of skin. None of us asked for that. That's our thrownness. We're historic beings, and we have to somehow make sense of our identity, our human journey, given our historic reality. Also in liberalism is the importance of conscience and trying to be true to what we perceive as truth within ourselves as much as we can, acting on that. So the role of will or volition is very, very important. It's not just thinking about these principles, but how do I act on those principles to bring into being what is seen as a good life, a meaningful life, a truthful life, an authentic life, a happy life. There's various words that can be used for something like that. Usually within this element of choice or agency and freedom is the notion of relationships are contractual as well. So we get, as we'll be moving through this the next few lectures on liberalism, what the nature of contractual relationships are. So where did these principles come from then? I mean, that have so shaped and which we are enfolded in. It's one sense the matrix we live within in terms of making sense of issues, the hot button issues in our culture wars. And so important to understand there are certain principles or roots, if we can see, that are often under the ground that shape the trunk, the fruit on the tree, and they predefine often decisions we come to in controversial issues in the culture wars. And I'll begin to explore a little bit of why this is the case when we hit these conflictual issues. I might also add that elements of liberalism would also see conflict is essential also in terms of making sense politically, in terms of identity politics, and much else. So where do these principles come from, or where do these prejudices come from? Where do they emerge in history in a more dramatic form? Obviously, there's elements of them in classical Greek thought. You can find tensions between Plato and Aristotle at work, and elements of the emerging Christian tradition within the biblical period, and then what we call the patristic or late antique period. But for our purposes, we want to look at the emergence of these principles as they take on more substantive form in what we call the modern world, which we all are, for good or ill, dwell within. It's the house within which we live, move, or have our being. So the first real dramatic element of that comes from philosophy, late medieval thought. Within significant elements of the Western tradition, politically, there was the sense of the Holy Roman Empire. So there was the collective, the common, and the individual was but a part of this much bigger story. And when push came to shove, it was the collective, it was the empire that everyone sort of gave their allegiance to. And it was the same within the West. The church, the Roman Catholic Church, was the dominant religious institution. So between politics at a big level and religion at a big level, the individual was always secondary, tertiary to this much bigger meta-narrative or greater vision was at work. But by the late Middle Ages, two philosophical traditions emerged that were going to challenge that. One was nominalism, and the other was voluntarism. Nominalism prioritizes philosophically, and this is one element of nominalism. There's much more to it as a philosophical tradition, but it prioritizes the importance of the individual. So when you have the individual and community and the collective and the big stories, it's the individual who has to begin to take themselves more serious, fight for their own rights, their liberty, their freedom, and against which is often seen the oppressive nature of the institutions, whether they're political or religious, of the past. And so you get this dynamic set up between liberty and individuality versus oppressive religious political institutions. And so this nominalism as a philosophical tradition pits this dualism against one another, and you can see the birth in that sense of liberalism in there. The second is voluntarism, or the will, from Latin volens in that sense. So not only the importance of the individual and their liberty, but acting on that in good conscience against what is seen as oppressive institutions, oppressive ideologies, oppressive ideas, theological, philosophical, whatever. And so this bringing together in late medieval philosophy, nominalism, the individual, and voluntarism, the will, acting on that. So this is the first movement philosophically, and you can already see the principles of liberalism at work philosophically in late medieval thought. Stage two in this journey then is the rise of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. And the clash then becomes many of the great reformers of the 16th century, Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Anabaptist, are important here as we live in the Fraser Valley, as we have a strong element of Anabaptist Mennonites and Calvinist or Dutch Reform thinkers. And so to understand often how elections are going to end up in Abbotsford, you just have to understand the particular historic background of the Mennonites and the Reformed traditions. But let me just land here for a bit and discuss that. And so with the 16th century, the gradual position taken by reformers is that the Roman Catholic Church could not be reformed. It would not be reformed. It was stubborn and obstinate, and also there was a huge gap between the ideals of Christianity and the reality of what it would become. So people like Martin Luther come along, Calvin a little later, the Anabaptist Mennonites. And what do? They appeal to the principles of liberty, of choice, of equality, of individuality, to critique what they see as the collective of the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, and the Roman Catholic Church. And so you can see we're moving from philosophically these principles of liberty and choice and acting on that, volens, to now the formal and material outworking of those particular principles. Now, of course, we live in today a society in which Christianity and Christendom does not dominate, but the principles of liberalism in the Protestant Reformation, very much once secularized, shape liberalism and continue to shape liberalism in that sense. And so the second phase of the first then is the philosophical tradition of late medieval thought, in which the principles of individuality, liberty, choice are articulated philosophically. Then the Protestant Reformation, very much at a formal and material level, embodies that. And you can see very clearly also when we think of the language of pluralism today. You can already see in the 16th century the fragmentation in Christianity with the multiplicity of denominations. So you're getting Christianity fragmenting, and you get a pluralism at work, because even though the Protestant reformers said the Bible was the source of authority, then the question is, well, whose interpretation of the Bible? And once we start with the position that each person has the right to interpret the text, their heart, the church, politics, economics, literature as it say fit, then you get a collision of freedoms. Whose interpretation of the text? And so this is where, even though at one level the text, the Bible, is seen as prominent, in fact there's far deeper principles or interpretive principles at work by which they come to the text. And those principles are liberty, choice, individuality, conscience, agency, all of these principles which are very much with us today, but secularized in that sense. So in many ways, we are just secularized Protestants in the late modern, postmodern world. So the principles that were released in the 16th century, but applied in a religious, theological, ecclesial context, political context, are very, very much with us today, although in a secularized version in that sense. So what they were appealing to at this period of time was freedom of religion, hence denominations. I might also ask, this is also a period of time of India, in the Punjab, in which the Sikh tradition is emergent. The same principles are at work. Guru Nanak is going to critique what he sees as problematic elements of Hinduism and Islam, and he's going to create a totally new religion. And so within India, you're getting its own sort of reformation, the creation of a new religion, and in the 16th century, you're getting the creation of a totally new form of Christianity. Both the Sikh tradition and Protestant Christianity emerge at the same period of history, one in the Punjab, one in Europe. Underneath it, though, are the principles of the individual using their freedom as they see fit, in good conscience, to reinterpret and create totally new forms of religious communities. Protestantism in Europe, Sikh tradition in Punjab, and parts of northern India itself at the time. And so 16th century is a very pivotal time in Western and Asian civilizations for reasons that we have inherited today. We're all heirs of history in that sense. So the principles then of liberty, choice, individuality, acting on that we find in late medieval philosophy, worked out in the Protestant Reformation and the fragmentation that occurs with the increasing multiple denominations or pluralism at work, is the same thing happening in India at the time. Now, the next phase of this, as we look at what we call classical liberalism, so the principles are at work in late medieval philosophy. They're now practically being worked out in the rise of denominations, Protestant denominations. The next step along that journey was to argue against what we would call a mercantilist economic tradition, which the state was very, very involved as much as possible in shaping and guiding the economy Many Protestants, and of course this tradition was also at work in late medieval Italy also, with some of the principles of liberty and choice being directed towards the economic sphere, is why cannot the individual, using their freedom as they see fit, all being equal agents in this, challenge the state, its involvement in the marketplace, to open up what we would call a market economy or laissez-faire, hands-off economics. So just as laissez-faire can be applied to economic, previously to that, it's also applied to intellectual thought, hands-off. Nobody has the right to say what is right, what is wrong. There are just perspectives, there are interpretations, there are ways of interpreting the Bible, and each has the right to interpret as they see fit. So hands-off in the economic sphere as well. So laissez-faire is not only an economic doctrine in that sense, it's also an intellectual doctrine that no one has the right to tell another how they should think, whether it's politics, whether it's the church, whether it's education. And so now we're applying this next phase to the economic sphere. So in late medieval Italy, Florence, Genoa, Venice, Rome, entrepreneurialism is coming in becoming very significant, and the state in this place should stay out. The city-states vie with one another. But also in Europe, the Protestant Reformation was as much about freedom of religion as it was about freedom. Notice here again, freedom, liberty, choice, freedom of the marketplace. Hence, in the economic theory was known as the Physiocratic economic theory. And so freedom is now being applied, and liberty and choice and agency, to the marketplace as well. And so not only in this particular movement as we move through history is the principles of liberty and choice and equality and individuality being applied to religion and different ways of interpreting religions, whether it's a Sikh tradition or the fragmentation of Protestantism in Europe, but now to the economic sphere. So when we hear the word, and also I might also add, another one of the clashes here became the clash between religion and science. So just as people like Luther and Calvin and the Anabaptists argued that they should have freedom to critique what they saw was the aberrations of the Roman Catholic Church or deconstruct what they saw was the problem, so certain forms of science begin to come along in 16th, 17th century. They're not only deconstructing or critiquing the Roman Catholic Church itself, they are seeing Christianity or religion as the problem. So the tensions with Copernicus and Galileo when it came to astronomy and the heliocentric notion of the universe versus the geocentric, and the sciences are beginning to emerge. So once again, you get, so science is appealing to the liberty and the freedom of the scientist to investigate the larger cosmos, and in this case astronomy, but it moves into other elements of investigation as well. And so you're getting a clash of liberties. Is if science clashes with religion, if Protestantism clashes with Catholicism, then the content of whose liberty should dominate, and you're beginning to see very clearly, very acutely the birth of a form of fragmentation of which today we're in the inheritance of pluralism. This is also the period of the rise of the nation states as well. So just as the Holy Roman Empire increasingly subsides, interesting, we get a bit of a rise of that today in the clash between the European Union and Brexit, or where you get states that don't want to belong to the EU. One is the big vision of people working together for the unity of a large region. The others are arguing for particular rights of nation states. These issues go back really to the 16th, 17th century as well. And so the principles of the ideology of liberalism, we can see them being played out between Protestantism and Catholicism. We see them played out in the economic sphere. We're seeing the rise of nation states at this particular point. And of course, then these ideological conflicts about whose version of freedom should dominate. And if my understanding of reality is truer than yours, in religion you get denominations, in worst case scenario, states start going to war with one another over whose version of the good life ideologically should dominate, hence all the religious wars at the time, which then gave rise to states moving in the direction of secularism as an ideology, because if religion was dominant, religion leads to violence. We see these arguments in the New Atheists, for example, today. You let religious free, the claws come out, and then you get violence. Hence, you need a strong state to some degree control or leash religion. And secularism then becomes the answer. And we'll be exploring this a little later in the classes of how when secularism becomes its own imperial ideology and colonizes other ways of knowing, just as science itself. So in science increasingly emerging in 16th, 17th century, arguing the empirical way of knowing, inductive, deductive logic is the only way to know. What that does, of course, it colonizes all other forms or ways of knowing. And in that sense, freedom becomes very hooked into one definition of freedom, my notion of freedom, and we'll see how this plays itself out. So liberalism in its classical phase, we can see this, working itself out, say, in the Conservative Party in Canada or republicanism in the United States. Conservative Party in Canada, often the argument is we want lighter state, we want lighter taxes, more freedom, initially the freedom of religion versus forms of agnostic or atheist secularism, that freedom should be held high, it should be respected, and it should be honored. But also the close link between religion and the marketplace. So if we have freedom of religion, people who are of a right of center perspective but very religious also will argue the freedom of the marketplace. And once you argue for the freedom and liberty of the marketplace, then you get the notion of lighter taxes, a lighter state. It's interesting, this is being called into question with the COVID crisis a bit, because even people on the right, whether Republicans in the States or Canada, the conservatives, they're recognizing very clearly you need a strong federal government to deal with, obviously, the issues of COVID, but all these people being put out of work, who's going to take care of them? You're going to leave that to society? You're going to leave it to the marketplace? No, the federal government is being asked, and rightly so, to intervene in the economy to assist people as it should. And so classical liberalism very much emerges at a period of time in which the old order is breaking down. Liberty is used, it's applied to religion. The consequence of that is people clash in whose version of liberty, whose interpretation of the Bible, and whether a person comes from that background or not. The important point to get here is the principles of liberty, and you'd merely secularize notions of protest and liberty, then you, in many ways, discover where we are today politically, each vying and defining the content of liberty quite differently. And as I mentioned, also the use of liberty in the marketplace. So you get this merging of religion in a certain understanding of how economics is to be worked out, laissez-faire. And so you'll often get today what's called classical liberalism, which is really just the argument for lighter state, lighter taxes, more power to the individual to engage in the marketplace with as little interference as possible. Now, so when we hear the word conservative today, and I'll just end with this, when we hear the word conservative today in Canada or elements of Europe, republicanism in the States, what are they conserving? And this is absolutely important that this is understood. They're conserving what we call classical liberalism. They're conserving the 16th, 17th century understanding that you'll find in Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, to some degree Edmund Burke, David Hume, John Locke, many of these thinkers who argued that the state, we're in a contractual relationship with it. If the state does not fulfill our wants and needs, then it goes. But all relationships are contractual in the sense, And so the state is purely secondary to the wishes and wants of the citizens at any given time. And so conservatism today is conserving that 16th, 17th, 18th century understanding of religion, economics, and politics, in which the rights of the individual are paramount. This is also the period of time, of course, when the United States is being founded. And this is to understand the rise of the United States, essential to understand 16th, 17th century English European political thinking, and why in the United States liberty, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, these are all products of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And the United States in its founding very much came out of that classical liberalism of Locke and Burke and Smith and Hume, and Tom Paine is very important in all of this also. And so Canada's history is different. We do have that element of us, but we have what's called the Tory touch, which we'll be looking at later on in this class. But to understand the founding of the United States, essential to understand it's a child, it was birthed by 16th, 17th, 18th century classical liberalism, which today we call conservatism. So to some, there are principles of liberalism. Those principles have to be applied. 16th, 17th, 18th century, they're applied in the area of religion. You get fragmentation and pluralism. They're applied in the area of economics, which leads to a lighter state, lighter taxes, laissez-faire, both in the realm of ideas and the area of economics. It is these ideas then that are very much fomenting and fermenting that are back of the founding of Canada and the United States. So to understand the diverse North American experience, it's absolutely essential to understand the Anglo-European context from within which Canada and the United States was birthed and the implications of that. So conservatism today means conserving 16th, 17th, 18th century understanding of religion and economics, often in opposition to some elements of science, certainly a greater state involvement, more power to the individual, and often secularism is often seen as a threat to the liberty of classical conservatives also, because there's a certain form of what we call hard or aggressive secularism, which is very anti-religious. And so classical conservatives try and maintain the centrality of religion in terms of their own lives, but when applied, it usually works itself out in traditional family values, issues of pro-life, certain views of euthanasia, market economy, law and order issues, which we'll be touching on later as we get into modern forms of liberalism and then postmodern forms of liberalism.